Before the bombing, tanks blasting each other to smithereens, and airplanes shooting each other out of the sky, there is one very important step: a declaration of war. But what happens exactly when one country declares war on another? And how is modern war waged once it's been declared? War is described as a state of hostilities between one state and another. In our history, war was far more frequent than it is today. In fact, war was a fairly commonplace state of affairs in some regions. Before the rise of empires, tribes could be considered to exist in a permanent state of aggression between neighbors. But as tribes united and formed larger social groups, conflict became more formalized. As the world entered the age of empires, diplomacy has become important for guaranteeing social stability. However, there was still no formalized way of initiating hostilities with a would-be adversary. If the target was a large enough nation, you might send emissaries announcing your intentions to initiate hostilities so that your country's traders could be forewarned of pending conflict. However, often it's just as beneficial to launch a surprise attack with no formal announcement of violence. In the Roman Empire, the act of declaring war became a ritual known as festivals, although the practice began to wane during its rise into the imperial era. All throughout the Old Testament and ancient texts, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have examples of declarations of war. It wasn't until the world approached the Westphalian, nation-state era that the war took on greater formalities. In a world of powerful nation-states or empires, being seen as a bad faith actor could have significant repercussions for you and your people. Thus, a greater emphasis was put on actual declarations of war itself, and even more importantly, the casus belli, or justified reason for war. If a nation could give at least the illusion of having justified reasons for war, the diplomatic consequences could be minimized. A casus belli justifies a reason for going to war due to the actions or provocations against the declaring nation, while a casus foederis is reserved for when threats or offenses are directed at an ally. As a nation formally articulates its casus belli, it lays out its reasons for going to war, how it's going to prosecute said war, and what other nations could do to prevent it from going to war. For example, in the modern example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the justification for war was the claimed genocide of Russian-speaking populations inside Ukraine by the Ukrainian government, and the denazification of the government itself. Putin then advised the world that he did not intend to occupy the nation, thus laying out how he would prosecute the war. Previously, he claimed that he would not use force if NATO agreed to never allow Ukraine membership and if it removed specific weapons from Central and East Europe, thus laying out his conditions for what would prevent his invasion. Sadly for Mr. Putin, there was never any evidence of genocide inside Ukraine, and claiming that you're going to denazify a government run by a Jew is frankly the height of ridiculousness. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the world did not accept Russia's casus belli and swiftly moved to punish it economically. And that's exactly why a good casus belli is critical for avoiding international fallout over your declaration of war. In the modern age, the United Nations strictly forbids all signatory countries from engaging in war, except under two key conditions. The first is a means of defending itself or an ally against aggression, and the second is if the UN body has voted in favor of said war. The UN, however, does reserve the right to ask member nations to declare war on non-signatory countries that embark on wars of aggression. A famous example of the UN at work was the first invasion of Iraq, when the UN authorized a US-led coalition to use force to remove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. An equally famous example is the Second Iraq War, during which the United States and its allies, using very bad intelligence, did not get authorization to attack Iraq and yet did so anyway, in violation of the UN Charter. But what actually happens when a country declares war? Even before hostilities begin, a nation planning on engaging in war will usually take steps to mitigate the resulting diplomatic, political, and especially economic fallout. Allies and partner nations will be warned of a planned course of action, and sometimes their counsel sought out. This can take place in secret so as to not tip off a future adversary that one is preparing for combat against them. Allies on the whole do not appreciate being blindsided by major international conflict, and giving them advance warning is critical. But this warning is important for economic reasons as well. In our modern world, economies are interconnected with each other in very intricate ways, so that even the most bitter of enemies will usually have a fair amount of trade between them. The disruption of critical goods and services can be catastrophic in the event of a war, and thus speaking with allies beforehand about your intentions is a good way to begin to prepare alternate sourcing methods for critical trade items. In its preparation to invade Ukraine, Russia sought out assurances from China that it would import significant amounts of Russian wheat, and if the EU banned all imports of energy from Russia, then China would take up the slack so as to limit the disruption to the Russian economy from sanctions. As Britain prepared for war against Argentina and the Falklands, it advised the United States and other NATO allies, and this helped identify key weaknesses in the British military, which the US moved to shore up, as it was feared that having Britain fail against such a weak power as Argentina would make NATO look weak. Once allies and partner nations have been warned of an intention to go to war, a country will begin to create contingency plans to minimize the disruption to its economy. Sometimes these plans are overt and plainly obvious to all, such as the stockpiling of war-critical goods prior to Germany's invasion of Poland in World War II. Often, though, these plans are kept as secretive as possible so as to not give advance warning to an enemy. The next step is handling internal political requirements for formal declarations of war. For instance, in the United States, the Congress must give authorization to the president for war. Thus, a president will lay out his justification for war before Congress and ask for a vote. A majority is needed for a formal declaration of war, and this process is meant to check the power of the presidency so that the power to wage war doesn't rest with one man alone. The authorization for use of military force in 2001 was passed by Congress to authorize the president to use all means available to neutralize, capture, or destroy all those who had planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, or anyone who harbored these individuals. However, the president is authorized to use military force for a set amount of time before being required to ask for a formal declaration of war, though this is typically limited for things such as combating asymmetrical threats such as ISIS. Typically, when it comes to carrying out anti-terrorism measures, the president doesn't need authorization from Congress. Each nation is different, however, and some nations vest their whole power for declaring war on their leader alone. This bypasses the traditional need to court political opponents who may refuse to authorize war, but runs the risk of putting the power to launch a destructive conflict in the hands of one man and his own agendas. Such a lack of checks on power often leads to disaster. Once war is declared, however, many things happen very rapidly. The first thing to happen is a nation's armed forces become mobilized for war. Though if one is planning on launching a conflict, this typically happens well in advance. The downside is that it gives an enemy plenty of advance warning, but the upside is that once authorization for war is granted, armed forces can quickly move to seize objectives and prosecute said war. The most important step in mobilizing for war is securing supplies. In ancient times, armies were small enough that they could forage for supplies as they marched. Though this limited their speed and their direction of travel, it did, however, allow them to more quickly mobilize as they had to gather fewer initial supplies. Modern war, however, makes foraging extremely ineffective and can cause massive political fallout as food meant for civilians is instead seized by occupying troops. This was a major problem for the Iraqi army in the First Gulf War, as its troops ransacked Kuwaiti cities for supplies, vilifying them on the world stage. Today, a modern army will have an entire logistical corps responsible for solely keeping the machinery of war moving. This means dispersing food, ammunition, sheltering supplies, and repair equipment both prior to and during conflict, and then managing stockpiles of war material throughout the length of the conflict. Despite being unsung heroes, the men and women who feed, clothe, equip, and shelter modern militaries are the ones who make combat possible. Mobilization also means transportation, and armed forces need to be moved to where they'll need to be persecuting combat operations. In 1859, Napoleon III showed how important modern mobilization was when he moved 130,000 soldiers into Italy via military railways. This prompted other nations to look carefully at their mobilization plans and update them for the modern age. Today, mobilization typically includes temporarily suspending civilian or commercial traffic so troops and equipment can be quickly relocated to where they're needed. As Russia prepared for its invasion of Ukraine, it suspended civilian and commercial rail traffic across part of Russia and its ally Belarus, so it could quickly move the required equipment and personnel to the Ukrainian border. The next step in mobilization is activating a nation's reservists. For most of human history, reservists were basically the bulk of a nation's fight forces. Nations and empires were rarely ever rich enough to afford a sizable professional standing army, and would instead do most of their fighting with hired mercenaries. That's because citizens were needed to tend the crops and livestock, so they were vital to ancient economies. Subsequently, most fighting happened in between planting and harvesting periods. Every male citizen of a certain age was expected to be ready to enter military service if ordered to in militia formations. Sometimes these militias were well trained, often they weren't. Thus, the relative simplicity of some early and even medieval weaponry. Poorly trained militias were also why mercenary units, who were professional full-time fighters, were greatly effective in combat. Toward the end of the 17th century, as the world entered the Westphalian nation-state era, professional standing armies became the norm and mercenaries went out of favor. However, it was impractical to maintain a standing force capable of undertaking a military campaign at all times, given that nations weren't in a constant state of war, and that every soldier on the front line was not a worker back home helping maintain the economy. Thus, formal reservists were established, and typically manned by those discharged from full-time active duty and held in reserve status for a number of years. However, even men who had never actually enlisted in the military service were often forced to join reserve forces in case of war. The creation of modern reserves were especially vital for Prussia in the wake of its defeat by Napoleon, who mandated that on top of giving up large swaths of territory, it was no longer allowed to have an army stronger than 42,000 men. Instead, Prussia put new recruits through a short period of training before releasing them into the reserves, thus maintaining the treaty-obligated maximum of 42,000 active-duty soldiers while actually preparing tens of thousands more men for combat. When Prussia was thrust into war once more, its reserve program allowed it to call up much greater numbers of trained soldiers than was expected. Today, nations around the world operate a system of reservists for some or all of their military branches. The United States has perhaps the most capable reserve force in the world, with all 5 branches of its military having their own reserves. American reservists receive 1 weekend of training a month and 2 weeks a year during the summer, and have often deployed during combat operations, giving them a degree of experience unmatched by most other nations. By comparison, the U.S.'s 2 main rivals, China and Russia, struggle to maintain a capable reserve force. Chinese reservists might only get 240 hours of training a year, and this includes both military and political indoctrination training. That's 10 days compared to the U.S. reservists' 38, which is dedicated to full-time military training. Russia also struggles with maintaining a modern reservist force. Promising enlisted soldiers will be offered a reserve contract in an effort to boost the professionalism of reserve forces, but the nation struggles to properly equip and train the reservists. On paper, Russian reservists are meant to train as often as their American counterparts, and some units manage to achieve this, but in reality, training is sporadic. Reservists are often used to fill in capability gaps, allowing the line units to do their job more effectively. In combat, line units will typically bear the brunt of the fighting, with reservists responsible for secondary objectives or filling in gaps as casualties force line units out of the fighting. However, as conflict rages on, the distinction between active duty and reserve status fades to insignificance. The importance of reservists can't be overstated, as with a good, well-trained reserve force, a nation can't replenish losses and isn't capable of the broad, sweeping military operations that modern combat requires. In case of war with either Russia or China, for instance, the United States is expected to immediately fully mobilize its reserves and quickly send them into battle. But now that war has been declared and reserves mobilized, what happens next? Each nation has its own range of capabilities, but nations like the United States follow a set procedure for engaging in conventional power. First, air and ground units are rapidly dispatched for SEAD missions, or suppression of enemy air defenses. Air superiority fighters like the F-15, F-22, and F-18 will escort specialized aircraft meant to directly target enemy ground air defenses. This will typically provoke enemy fighters into rising to defend friendly airspace and vulnerable fire control radar for ground-based air defense networks. Escort fighters are responsible for sweeping the skies, allowing SEAD aircraft to do their job. In the United States military, SEAD missions are undertaken by the Wild Weasel aircraft, or aircraft specially configured to take out enemy ground infrastructure associated with air defenses. First, a Wild Weasel aircraft will make use of radar jamming to seriously degrade enemy targeting radar. This works by sending a return signal to the enemy radar that confuses the system enough to not provide a valid firing solution. However, as the incoming aircraft gets closer to the radar, the more powerful ground radar is eventually able to burn through this noise, making radar jamming or spoofing only effective up to a certain range, and decreasing exponentially with distance to target. The point of jamming isn't to completely blind radar though, it's simply to erode it enough to allow Wild Weasel aircraft to get close enough to launch their weapons without being blown out of the sky. This is where anti-radiation missiles come into play. These weapons are specifically designed to sniff out electromagnetic signals put out by enemy radar and antennae and home in on their target. More advanced weapons are able to remember a signal's origin even if the enemy installation turns off the radar, thus allowing it to strike its target no matter what. The accuracy of an ARM decreases with distance to target, so it's important to get close while the target is still emitting strong radiation for the missile to get a good lock. This is why historically Wild Weasel missions have been the most dangerous a fighter pilot could undertake. New weapons, including smart glide bombs such as the GBU-53 Stormbreaker, in use by the U.S. Air Force, are greatly increasing the effectiveness of Wild Weasel operations. These small bombs feature sophisticated sensors and flight surfaces that allow them to be launched at greater distances. They're even smart enough to track and destroy a moving target. Because they run a lot colder than normal missiles and are much smaller, glide bombs can be more difficult to shoot out of the sky by an air defense site's point defense and short-range weapon systems. SEAD operations, however, can also be undertaken by ground forces, typically in the form of small-scale rapid strike forces. With mobility being a priority, these raiders are lightly armed but carry enough firepower to suppress an enemy air defense site. Whatever the method, the most important part of a SEAD strike mission is destruction of enemy radar. Destruction of the missiles and launch vehicles themselves is completely unnecessary in the short term. Without targeting radar, missile batteries are useless assets. However, many air forces still use cluster munitions to cripple support vehicles and ensure an air defense site is permanently shut down. The air superiority mission will be ongoing alongside SEAD operations. In modern war, one cannot safely operate without air superiority. Once this might have involved in wheeling dogfights and machine guns, but today air superiority is more about long-range sensors and missiles. In a modern networked air force, targets are spotted either by long-range radars or by stealth platforms, with data links sharing targeting data to other aircraft. Missiles are typically lobbed at distances of dozens of miles, but new, even longer-range missiles are capable of greater ranges. Once fired, a missile will gain altitude, flying high into the upper atmosphere, where the air is thinner and thus the missile can travel more efficiently with reduced drag. This also allows the missile to enjoy greater kinetic energy on its way down toward a target by using the Earth's gravity. A missile need not score a direct hit, but rather simply get near enough a target for its fragmentation warhead to explode and shred the delicate systems of an aircraft with shrapnel. Further intermingling with air superiority and SEAD operations will be quick follow-on strikes on enemy command, control, and communications, or C3 systems. The United States typically combines these operations together thanks to its use of stealth aircraft and overwhelming air superiority capabilities, allowing it to strike devastating blows in rapid succession to an enemy's most critical support infrastructure. Disrupting an enemy's ability to communicate helps throw their forces into disarray and prevents them from working together to present a cohesive offense or defense. It also leaves enemy commanders operationally blind, further degrading their ability to respond to threats. This was why the United States and partners were so easily able to surgically destroy Iraqi units during the First and Second Gulf Wars. The importance of destroying an enemy's C3 systems was never more clear than in Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, when the Russian military failed to shut down Ukraine's ability to coordinate its defense in the opening days of the war. The result was an offensive that failed to meet its daily objectives time and again, and greatly expanded Russian casualties in men and equipment both. As with SEAD missions, neutralizing an enemy's C3 can take the form of airstrikes or ground action, once more typically by small but fast lightly armed forces. These operations can be extremely risky, however, as enemy C3 nodes are typically very well defended. Next comes the part of the war most people are aware of: the detection, suppression, and direct destruction of enemy forces. Typically, this is achieved by a combination of different operations. Air assaults can open up a conflict by inserting hundreds or even thousands of troops behind enemy lines. This can be nothing more than a flanking maneuver to put pressure on an enemy formation from two different directions at once, or to cut off avenues of escape. Air assaults, however, can also be used to capture or destroy high-value targets, such as bridges, runways, missile silos, and communication nodes. Air assaults, however, come with a high degree of risk, due to the fact that they cannot be heavily armed and must be quickly reinforced. Two of Russia's major air assault operations in Ukraine on the opening day of the conflict met with disaster when ground forces were unable to advance rapidly enough to link up with the air assault element holding airports outside Kiev. Heavily armed Ukrainian defenders were able to overpower the air assault force before ground forces could reach them, or they could be reinforced by conventional forces flown in on large transport aircraft. This is why it's important to use air assault forces judiciously and with close coordination of ground forces, while setting realistic goals. A painful lesson the Allies also learned in World War II during Operation Market Garden, when almost the entire air assault force was wiped out by the Germans. Amphibious assaults can either be part of a direct action force when a battle requires one military to invade a territory via the sea, or can be used in a similar fashion to air assault operations, flanking enemy defensive positions and striking at poorly defended rear areas. In the Ukraine conflict, Russia used amphibious assaults to flank Ukrainian defensive positions in the southeast of the nation, though it temporarily mulled the possibility of launching a decisive strike at the city of Odessa at the start of the war, and thus seizing the most important commercial facility on the Ukrainian coast. However, much like air assaults, amphibious assaults are a risky affair, as heavy equipment is typically not available in the opening waves of an assault. Beachheads are typically established by modern armed forces who might have very sparing support from armored vehicles and rely extremely heavily on air platforms for fire support. This beachhead, however, allows for the rapid unloading and deployment of heavier weapons platforms in significant numbers, such as main battle tanks. Beachheads remain extremely vulnerable in the opening days of an operation, and without adequate fire support from the air or long-range artillery, are at great risk of complete failure. The bulk of fighting in a conventional conflict, however, is undertaken by maneuver forces meant to directly engage with and destroy enemy formations. In the U.S., the job falls to the U.S. Army's armor and mechanized infantry, as well as its fleet of attack helicopters. Tank formations are supported by mechanized infantry who can quickly deploy to eliminate enemy infantry, which, thanks to anti-tank weapons, can pose a significant danger to even the toughest tanks. Armored vehicles such as the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle provide some anti-tank capabilities thanks to its anti-tank missiles, but its high-speed Bushmaster cannon and its light armor is meant to defeat enemy infantry and lightly armored vehicles. IFVs also quickly carry friendly infantry safely into the thick of battle thanks to their armor, which is capable of withstanding small arms fire and provides limited protection from heavy caliber weapons. Flying overhead as both scouts and strike platforms, Army aviation works closely with ground forces to neutralize enemy positions and provide direct fire support. Its chief role, however, is hunting down enemy tanks, as its ability to target a tank's thin top armor combined with extremely high speeds makes it a lethal threat to armor formations. Their vantage point in the sky also makes them great scouts, and platforms such as the American Apache and the Russian Ka-52 combine high speed and heavy armor to make them formidable platforms. Once an enemy has been engaged and war progresses, combat will shift between all of the previous combat operations as the battlefield changes and evolves over time. Enemy reinforcements might require ongoing air superiority and SEAD ops, and direct action operations will make flexible use of air assault and amphibious maneuvers to destroy the enemy and achieve victory. Now go watch What If Russia Invades Ukraine for a peek into Putin's future plans, or click this other video instead.